When my daughter-in-law Penelope handed me that prepaid bus ticket to Sunset Manor and looked me straight in the eye and said, "Please don't embarrass the family anymore," I felt something die inside me. 30 years. 30 years of being the reliable mother-in-law, the free babysitter who dropped everything when they needed me, the woman who sold her own home to help fund my son's first business venture. 30 years of loving her like the daughter I never had, defending her when others whispered she was only after Bradley's potential, believing in her goodness when my instincts screamed otherwise. I stood there in her marble foyer, holding that ticket like it was my death certificate, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my 71 years. But 7 days later, exactly 7 days, she was on her knees on my doorstep at that very retirement home, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, begging for my help. Because you see, when you push a woman who has nothing left to lose, you unleash a force you never saw coming. Subscribe if you believe in second acts, because this story proves they exist. My name is Vivienne, and when my son Bradley sold his tech startup for $37 million, it should have been the happiest day of our lives. Instead, it became the beginning of my worst nightmare. Bradley used to call me his lucky charm. When he was struggling to get investors for his software company, working 18-hour days in our garage, surviving on instant ramen and pure determination, he'd say, "Mom, you're the reason I keep going. You sacrificed everything so I could chase this dream." Those words sustained me through double shifts at the hospital, through selling my wedding ring to help him buy better equipment, through years of believing in his vision when everyone else called him a dreamer. But $37 million changed my son in ways I never could have predicted. The grateful entrepreneur who used to hug me every morning became a distant stranger who communicated through his assistant. The boy who once proudly introduced me as the strongest woman I know started referring to me as someone who came from a different generation, with an apologetic smile that felt like a slap. And Penelope, sweet Penelope, who used to bake cookies with me and call me Mom Viv. She metamorphosed like a butterfly, except this transformation revealed something uglier underneath. The moment that money cleared, she shed her humble origins like an old coat. Designer clothes replaced her Target wardrobe, charity galas filled her calendar, and suddenly, my presence at family dinners became a source of her obvious discomfort. The 10,000 square foot mansion they bought in the hills came with a pool house, and that's where I ended up. "It'll be perfect for you, Vivienne," Penelope had said with that plastic smile. "No stairs to worry about, and you'll have your privacy." Privacy. That was her way of saying I'd be hidden from their new social circle, tucked away like an embarrassing family secret. I thought I was living with family. I was wrong. I was living in a golden prison where my crime was reminding them of who they used to be before the money made them forget their souls. It started so subtly I almost missed it. "Vivienne, that cardigan is so nostalgic," Penelope would say at dinner parties, her laugh tinkling like broken glass. When I'd offer to help with the grandchildren's school events, she'd decline with, "Oh, they're used to a certain standard now. Best leave it to the professionals." I became the live-in help who happened to share DNA with the homeowner. My opinions on family matters went unasked. My traditions were outdated habits that might confuse the children. When my grandson wanted to show me his school project, Penelope would intercept with, "Don't bother, grandmother darling, she's tired." I watched from my pool house window as they hosted elaborate gatherings where I wasn't invited, celebrations of their new life that had no room for their old one. The woman who had helped raise those children, who had been their safe harbor during every storm, was systematically being erased from their story. I should have seen the eviction notice coming. All the signs were there, painted in Penelope's false smiles and my son's guilty avoidance. But love, even when it's not returned, makes you hope against hope that family still means something. I need you to understand who Penelope was before the money poisoned her soul. She came from Riverside, a working-class neighborhood where her mother cleaned offices and her father drove delivery trucks. When Bradley first brought her home 8 years ago, she was studying accounting at community college, working nights at a diner to pay her tuition. She had calloused hands from waitressing and genuine gratitude for every small kindness. I loved her immediately. She'd insist on doing dishes after Sunday dinner, always brought homemade dessert, and listened, really listened, when I told stories about Bradley's childhood. "Mom, Viv," she'd say, squeezing my hand, "I'm so grateful you raised such a good man. I promise I'll take care of him." Those words felt sacred then. Now they taste like ash in my memory. But $37 million revealed who Penelope truly was underneath that sweet facade. Within weeks of the sale closing, she hired a personal stylist, a social coordinator, and what she called a lifestyle consultant. The girl who once treasured a $20 necklace I gave her was suddenly dripping in jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. She joined the Harbor View Country Club, the most exclusive one in the city, and started hosting charity luncheons for causes she'd never heard of 6 months earlier. "It's about networking, Vivian," she explained when I questioned the $1,000 a plate fundraisers. "We have a responsibility to use our position for good." But I saw how her eyes lit up when society photographers took her picture, how she practiced her smile in the mirror before events. The worst part was watching her rewrite history. She began telling people that Bradley's success came from his sophisticated upbringing and family values of excellence. She conveniently forgot to mention the garage where he built his first programs, the ramen dinners, the nights I worked double shifts to keep the lights on. In her version of the story, I didn't exist until Bradley was already successful, a convenient grandmother who appeared to help with the children. The exclusion started with the Christmas card photo. "Vivian, we're trying for a more streamlined look this year," Penelope said, positioning herself, Bradley, and the children in front of their grand staircase. I watched from the kitchen window as the photographer captured their perfect family portrait, a family that somehow no longer included the woman who had made it all possible. At my grandson Timothy's 8th birthday party, I offered to help set up like I'd done every year since he was born. "Oh, that won't be necessary," Penelope chirped. "The event planner handles everything now." "But you could supervise from the pool house? Make sure the noise doesn't bother you?" I spent my grandson's birthday watching through a window as strangers orchestrated a celebration I'd been relegated away from. She was poisoning my grandchildren against me with surgical precision. "Grandmother has old-fashioned ideas about things," she'd tell them when I suggested they put away their iPads and play outside. "We don't want to hurt her feelings, but we do things differently now." Timothy, my sweet boy who used to beg for my bedtime stories, started looking at me like I was a museum piece, interesting but irrelevant. Family dinners became performances where I was the unwanted audience. They'd discuss vacation plans, school decisions, and future investments while I sat there like furniture, occasionally acknowledged with a patronizing smile. When I tried to contribute, Penelope would redirect the conversation with, "That's nice, Vivian, but we were discussing," and I'd fade back into invisibility. The breaking point came at their housewarming party, a lavish affair for 200 of their closest friends, none of whom I'd ever met. Penelope had specifically instructed me to keep a low profile that evening. "These are important business connections, Vivian. We need to make the right impression." I was banished to the pool house like a shameful secret while strangers celebrated in what should have been my family home. But I could hear them through the thin walls. I heard Penelope's friends asking about the little old lady by the pool, and I heard her response. "Oh, that's Bradley's mother. She's been having some difficulties adjusting to her age. We're looking into care facilities." Care facilities, like I was some burden they'd inherited rather than the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their success. That night, as I lay in my converted servants' quarters listening to laughter that deliberately excluded me, I realized I wasn't just unwanted. I was being actively erased. Tomorrow, I would learn just how far Penelope was willing to go to make that erasure complete. It was Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the housewarming party, where I'd been hidden away like a family embarrassment. Bradley had conveniently left for what Penelope called an urgent business trip to Seattle, though I later learned he was at a spa resort 2 hours away. The coward couldn't even face what his wife was about to do to his own mother. Penelope appeared at my pool house door at exactly 9 a.m., dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than I used to make in 3 months. She wasn't alone. She'd brought her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Regina Blackwood, who looked at me like I was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. "Vivian," Penelope said, her voice syrupy with false concern, "we need to have a family meeting." She led me into the main house, into that pristine white living room where I'd never felt comfortable sitting. Everything was white. The Italian leather furniture, the marble coffee table, the abstract paintings that looked like expensive accidents. I perched on the edge of a chair that probably cost more than my first car, while Penelope settled across from me with the confidence of someone about to deliver a rehearsed speech. "This is difficult for all of us," Penelope began, though her perfectly composed face showed no signs of difficulty. "Bradley and I have been discussing your living situation, and we've come to realize that this arrangement isn't working for anyone." She paused, waiting for me to respond, but I was too stunned to speak. Regina opened a leather folder and slid a glossy brochure across the coffee table. "Sunset Manor Assisted Living," it read. "A new chapter in gracious senior living." "We've already toured the facility," Penelope continued, her tone suggesting she was discussing vacation plans rather than disposing of family. "It's lovely, really. 3 meals a day, planned activities, medical care on site. You'll have friends your own age, people who share your perspective on life." The way she said perspective made it sound like a disease I'd contracted that might be contagious. I found my voice then, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Penelope, this is my home. This is my family." I looked around the sterile room, trying to find something, anything, that connected me to this place. I helped Bradley buy this house. I've been part of this family for 8 years, part of his life for 34. That's when her facade cracked, and I saw the viper that had been coiled underneath all along. Her smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Your home?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Vivian, let's be clear about something. This house was purchased with my husband's money. I am his family now. You are just a guest who has overstayed her welcome." She leaned forward, and her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than if she'd shouted. "The children are starting to pick up your outdated habits, your small-town mentality. Do you really think that's fair to them? They deserve better than being held back by someone who peaked at being a hospital janitor." Hospital janitor. She said it like it was something shameful, like 30 years of honest work caring for people was beneath contempt. I had been a medical technician, had helped save lives, had worked myself to exhaustion to give my son opportunities she couldn't even comprehend, but in her mouth, my life's work became a mark of failure. Regina spoke for the first time then, her voice as sharp as her appearance. "Mrs. Patterson, we have a bus ticket for tomorrow morning's departure. The facility is expecting you by 2 p.m. Your belongings will be shipped separately." She slid an envelope across the table. "There's also a small monthly allowance to help with your expenses. We're not heartless." "And if I refuse?" I managed to ask, though part of me already knew the answer. Penelope's smile returned, but now it looked like a weapon. "Then we'll have to explore other options, legal options. You see, you have no actual claim to this property, and continued trespassing would be unfortunate for someone your age." I spent that night packing 71 years of life into 2 borrowed suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. Everything else, furniture I'd inherited from my mother, photographs that chronicled decades of family memories, books I'd collected over a lifetime, had to be left behind. "The new residents will need the space," Penelope had explained with false sympathy. The worst part was saying goodbye to Timothy and little Sarah. They didn't understand why Grandma was leaving, why their mother spoke in hushed, urgent tones whenever they asked questions. "Are you going on vacation, Grandma?" Timothy asked, his 8-year-old eyes wide with confusion. I hugged him so tight I was afraid I might break him, knowing it might be the last time. Penelope stood in the doorway watching as I loaded my life into the back of a taxi, her arms crossed like she was supervising the removal of unwanted furniture. She didn't offer to help, didn't say goodbye, didn't even pretend to be sad. She just watched, probably counting the minutes until I was gone and her perfect life could continue without the inconvenience of my existence. The bus ride to Sunset Manor took 3 hours. 3 hours to travel from everything I'd known and loved to a sterile room in a building full of strangers. I pressed my face to the window and watched my old life disappear behind me, wondering how 30 years of love and sacrifice had led to this moment of complete abandonment. Room 237 at Sunset Manor was 8 feet by 10 feet of institutional beige walls, beige carpet, beige bedspread that smelled like industrial detergent and other people's disappointments. The single window faced the parking lot where I could watch visitors come and go to see residents who still had families that wanted them. My view of hope was a dumpster, and the back entrance where the laundry trucks made their deliveries. 3 days earlier, I'd been living in a pool house with marble countertops and a view of manicured gardens. Now I was sharing a bathroom with Mildred Kowalski, who had dementia and kept asking me if I'd seen her husband Walter, who'd been dead for 12 years. The cafeteria served meals at specific times, the activities director treated us all like children who needed constant supervision, and every surface was designed to be sanitized rather than lived on. I spent most of those first days staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, replaying every moment that had led me here. How had 30 years of devotion culminated in this sterile room that smelled like disinfectant and defeat? The monthly allowance Penelope had mentioned, $800, barely covered the facilities fees, let alone any dignity or independence. I was 71 years old, and my life story had apparently ended with a whimper in a place where people came to wait for death. The other residents tried to include me in their card games and television programs, but I couldn't focus on anything except the crushing weight of my situation. I had been discarded like an old appliance that had finally broken down. And unlike those other residents who spoke fondly of children who visited on weekends, I had been explicitly rejected by the only family I had left. It was my 4th day at Sunset Manor when desperation drove me to the one cardboard box I'd been avoiding, the memory box I'd salvaged from my pool house. Inside were the remnants of my real life, photo albums spanning decades, my late husband Harold's reading glasses, birthday cards from better times, and a manila envelope containing Harold's important papers that I'd never had the heart to go through after his death 5 years ago. Harold had been an accountant for 38 years, meticulous about documentation and obsessed with what he called financial security. Even when we barely had 2 nickels to rub together, he insisted on keeping copies of everything: insurance policies, tax returns, investment statements, even receipts for major purchases. Vivienne, he'd always say, paper trails protect people who don't have lawyers on retainer. Tucked between his life insurance policy and our mortgage documents was a folder labeled Bradley's Business Tech Flow Solutions. My heart started racing as I opened it. Inside were photocopies of incorporation papers, partnership agreements, and investment documents from when Bradley first started his company. Most of it was legal language I couldn't understand, but one document made my blood run cold with its implications. It was a shareholder agreement dated 8 years ago, back when Bradley was still working out of our garage, and every dollar counted. Harold's careful handwriting filled the margins with notes and calculations. At the bottom of the document, in red ink, he'd written, Vivienne Patterson, silent founding partner, 2% equity stake, veto power over major asset transfers and corporate restructuring for 5 years post-sale. I remembered now. Harold had insisted on this provision when Bradley incorporated the company. Son, he'd told Bradley, your mother gave up her career to support your dreams. If this company ever makes money, she deserves protection. Bradley had agreed readily. Back then, 2% of nothing was still nothing, and the idea that his garage startup would one day be worth millions seemed like fantasy. 2% of $37 million. I did the math 3 times on the back of an envelope, my hands shaking. $740,000. But it wasn't the money that made my heart race. It was that phrase Harold had underlined twice. veto power over major asset transfers and corporate restructuring. The next morning, I used the facility's landline to call Fitzgerald and Associates, the law firm Harold had used for our wills. When I explained who I was and what I'd found, the receptionist transferred me immediately to Winston Fitzgerald himself. Mrs. Patterson. His gravelly voice was suddenly very interested. I remember your husband well. Harold was one of the most thorough clients I ever had. Can you bring those documents to my office today? Fitzgerald's examination of the documents was thorough and devastating. This is ironclad, he said, adjusting his glasses as he studied Harold's meticulous notes. Your husband knew what he was doing when he insisted on this language. According to this agreement, you're not just a silent partner, you're a founding partner, with specific protective rights that can't be dissolved without your explicit consent. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though part of me was already beginning to understand. Fitzgerald smiled. The first genuinely warm smile I'd seen in weeks. It means, Mrs. Patterson, that any major changes to the company structure, any significant asset transfers, any attempts to reorganize the corporate entity for tax purposes, all of that requires your signature. And given that your son and his wife are almost certainly planning exactly those kinds of maneuvers to protect their windfall, he pulled out a legal calendar and showed me the dates. Corporate sales of this magnitude typically involve immediate restructuring to minimize tax liability. Based on standard practice, they have maybe a week before the window closes on their optimal tax strategies. Without your consent, they can't execute any of their financial planning. I left Fitzgerald's office with something I hadn't felt since that morning in Penelope's white living room. Power. Not just the power of money, though $740,000 would certainly change my life, but the power to say no to people who had thought I was too insignificant to matter. The power to make demands of people who had thrown me away like garbage. The woman they'd discarded as an embarrassing relic held the key to everything they wanted, and this time the conversation would happen on my terms. My phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, exactly 7 days after Penelope had handed me that bus ticket. I was in the Sunset Manor cafeteria, picking at scrambled eggs that tasted like rubber, when the facility's landline buzzed with an urgent call. Mrs. Patterson, the receptionist said, her voice tight with anxiety, your son is on the phone. He says it's an emergency. I took my time walking to the phone. For the first time in months, I wasn't rushing to accommodate someone else's crisis. When I finally picked up the receiver, Bradley's voice hit me like a hurricane, frantic, desperate, completely unlike the composed tech mogul who had let his wife throw me away. Thank God, he gasped, and I could hear him breathing heavily like he'd been running. There's a problem with the Megatech deal. The lawyers are saying there's some kind of outstanding shareholder issue that's blocking the entire transaction. They found some old incorporation papers with your name on them, and now they're demanding documentation proving clean ownership transfer. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, savoring the sound of his panic, before I responded with perfect calm. I know, Bradley. I'm quite aware of the shareholder issue. Another pause, longer this time. Put Penelope on the phone. Mom, what are you talking about? How could you possibly know? But I cut him off with an authority I hadn't used in years. Bradley, I said, put your wife on the phone, now. The steel in my voice must have shocked him, because I heard him calling for Penelope without another word of argument. When Penelope's voice came through the phone, it was already shrill with barely contained hysteria. Vivienne, what did you do? What kind of games are you playing? But I could hear the fear underneath her anger, the terror of someone who had just realized their perfect plan was crumbling. Games, Penelope? I asked, settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair by the phone with the satisfaction of someone who finally held all the cards. I haven't done anything. But you're about to learn that when you throw away family, sometimes that family takes their legal rights with them. I don't know what you're talking about, Penelope snapped, but I could hear the desperation creeping in. Whatever crazy scheme you think you're pulling, it won't work. We'll sue you into the ground if you try to interfere with our business." That's when I delivered the words that would haunt her nightmares. "Penelope, dear, I am your business. You see, 8 years ago, when Bradley incorporated TechFlow Solutions, my late husband, Harold, insisted that I be included as a founding partner, 2% equity stake, with veto power over any major asset transfers or corporate restructuring. It's all very legal, very binding, and very much still in effect." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long I wondered if she'd fainted. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. 2%. That's... I could hear her doing the math, could practically see her face going white as she calculated what 2% of $37 million meant. $740,000, I said helpfully. But more importantly, it means that your lovely tax avoidance schemes, your corporate restructuring plans, your asset transfers to avoid liability, none of it can happen without my signature. And right now, I'm not feeling particularly cooperative. What came next was the real Penelope, stripped of all pretense and social climbing polish. "You manipulative old witch," she screamed into the phone. "This is extortion. You can't hold our entire future hostage because your feelings got hurt." "Hold your future hostage?" I repeated, my voice rising for the first time. "Like you held my life hostage. Like you threw me out of my own family and shipped me off to die in this place because I was an embarrassment to your social climbing? Like you poisoned my grandchildren against me and erased me from 8 years of family history?" The next few minutes were a masterclass in desperation, as Penelope cycled through every manipulation tactic in her arsenal. First came the false tears. "Vivienne, I'm so sorry. We made a mistake. Please, come home and we'll work this out as a family." When I remained unmoved, she shifted to anger. "You're being vindictive and petty. This could destroy Bradley's entire career." Then came the frantic bargaining. "What do you want? More money? A bigger allowance? Your own wing of the house?" But she still didn't understand that this wasn't about money or accommodation. This was about respect, dignity, and the fundamental recognition that I was a human being who deserved better than being discarded like trash. I heard Bradley grab the phone back, his voice cracking with panic. "Mom, please, the lawyers are saying we have 48 hours to resolve this or the entire megatech deal falls apart. If we lose this sale, it's not just the money. My reputation in the industry will be destroyed. No one will ever trust me to deliver on a deal again." 48 hours, I repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting timing. You know, it took you less than 48 hours to decide I was unwanted garbage that needed to be removed from your perfect life, but now you need 48 hours of my consideration? How poetic." "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, my voice steady as granite. "You're going to come to Sunset Manor, both of you, and we're going to have a conversation about the terms under which I might consider signing your precious documents. And Penelope," I paused for maximum effect, "you're going to listen to every word I have to say, because for once in your entitled life, someone else holds the power you crave so desperately." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, Bradley's voice came through, smaller and more vulnerable than I'd heard it since he was a child. "Mom, what do you want from us?" "I want acknowledgement, Bradley. I want respect. I want the recognition that the woman who sacrificed everything for your success deserves better than being thrown away like an inconvenient relic. And most importantly, I want guarantees, legal, binding guarantees, that this family understands exactly who holds the real power in this relationship." "We'll be there tomorrow at noon," Bradley said, his voice defeated. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have..." But I hung up before he could finish his apology. Sorry was a word that came too easily when people needed something. What I wanted was action, commitment, and the kind of binding legal agreements that even people like Penelope couldn't manipulate their way out of. For the first time in months, I went to bed that night with a smile on my face. Tomorrow, the family that had discarded me would discover what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone else's decision. And this time, I would be the one setting the terms. They arrived at Sunset Manor the next day looking like defendants approaching a sentencing hearing. Bradley wore a wrinkled shirt and had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night spent calculating what his arrogance would cost him. Penelope, for the first time since I'd known her, looked genuinely afraid, her usual perfect composure replaced by the hollow-eyed panic of someone watching their empire crumble. But they weren't just facing me anymore. Sitting beside me in the Manor's sterile conference room was Winston Fitzgerald, the shark lawyer I'd retained with a small advance against my newfound stake. Across the table sat Regina Blackwood, Penelope's attorney, looking distinctly uncomfortable as she reviewed documents that made her client's position legally indefensible. "Let's be very clear about what's happening here," Fitzgerald began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years practicing corporate law. "Mrs. Patterson holds a founding partnership with veto power over any major corporate decisions. Without her consent, your megatech deal dies, your tax optimization strategies fail, and your entire financial future remains in legal limbo indefinitely." What followed was the most satisfying 3 hours of my life. We didn't just negotiate a settlement. We restructured an entire family dynamic with the cold precision of corporate law. First, the establishment of a $1 million irrevocable trust in my name, managed by trustees of my choosing, not theirs. Complete financial independence that could never again be used as leverage against me. But the money was just the beginning. Penelope would personally fund a matching donation to the Harold Patterson Memorial Scholarship for working-class students pursuing technology degrees, a legacy that would ensure my husband's name lived on in ways that mattered. Every year for the next 10 years, she would write a check that honored the man whose foresight had ultimately saved me. The agreement included what Fitzgerald called dignity clauses, legally binding commitments that Penelope would publicly acknowledge her treatment of me and apologize in writing to every person who had witnessed my humiliation at their social events. The apology would be published in the social pages, where she had once preened for photographers, ensuring that her social circle understood the cost of her cruelty. When Penelope signed her name to those documents, her hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. "I want you to know," she whispered, her voice thick with barely contained rage, "that I will never forgive you for this." I looked at her across the table and smiled. "Good," I replied. "Now you know how it feels." Within 2 weeks, I was moving out of room 237 at Sunset Manor and into what the contractors called a luxury in-law suite, though we all knew it was really a fortress of independence built into the structure of Bradley's mansion. The pool house had been gutted and rebuilt according to specifications I provided, not suggestions Penelope offered. My new home featured a separate entrance, a full kitchen where I could cook my own meals on my own schedule, and a living room with windows that looked out over the gardens I would help design. Most importantly, it included a legally binding easement that gave me irrevocable access to the property, regardless of who owned the main house. Never again would I live somewhere at the mercy of someone else's whims. The custody arrangement for Timothy and Sarah was spelled out in excruciating legal details. Every weekend, every holiday, every school event, my rights as their grandmother were now protected by court-enforceable agreements. Penelope could no longer poison them against me or exclude me from family decisions involving their welfare. But perhaps the most satisfying change was watching Bradley rediscover his spine. The stress of nearly losing everything had forced him to confront what his marriage had cost him, not just his relationship with me, but his own sense of integrity. He began spending real time with his children again, began questioning Penelope's social climbing priorities, began remembering who he used to be before $37 million corrupted his values. Penelope adapted to the new reality with the calculating precision of someone who understood that open rebellion would only make her situation worse. She was polite to me now, coldly, formally polite, but she no longer dismissed my opinions or excluded me from family gatherings. I had become someone whose displeasure could cost her everything she'd worked to build. Every morning, when she looked out her kitchen window and saw my separate entrance, every family dinner where I sat at the table as an equal rather than a tolerated burden, every social event where she had to introduce me as Bradley's respected mother rather than an embarrassing relic, it all served as a constant reminder that actions have consequences, and some people are more powerful than they appear. The transformation of our family dynamic was like watching a house of cards collapse and then rebuilding it with actual foundation. Bradley, faced with the reality of how close he'd come to losing everything, began the difficult work of examining who he'd become and deciding who he wanted to be going forward. The post-nuptial agreement we'd insisted upon was perhaps the most devastating blow to Penelope's sense of security. Half of Bradley's assets were now protected in trust for the children, beyond her reach in case of divorce. Her financial incentive to remain married had been significantly reduced, forcing them both to confront whether their relationship had any foundation beyond money and social status. Timothy and Sarah, freed from their mother's subtle manipulation, began rebuilding their relationship. With me, naturally. Timothy started asking me to help with his homework again, and Sarah began requesting the bedtime stories that Penelope had once dismissed as outdated nonsense. Watching their genuine affection return was worth more than any financial settlement. Sunday dinners became real family gatherings again, not performance pieces designed to showcase Penelope's domestic perfection. We talked about Timothy's science projects and Sarah's dance recitals, about books we'd read and places we wanted to travel. I was no longer the unwanted audience to their perfect family. I was part of the conversation. Bradley enrolled in therapy to address what he called his success-induced amnesia, his tendency to forget his values when external validation was at stake. He began volunteering as a mentor for young entrepreneurs from working-class backgrounds, sharing not just business strategies but the human cost of losing sight of your roots. Penelope adapted to her reduced status with the calculating grace of someone who understood that her options were limited. She could continue to live in luxury, but she would do so under the watchful eye of people who now understood exactly what she was capable of when she felt secure in her power. Our family was no longer perfect, but it was real. The glossy magazine version of success had been replaced by something more durable, relationships built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency, love that came with accountability rather than unconditional enablement. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: never let anyone, not even your own family, convince you that you're disposable. I spent weeks in that retirement home believing Penelope when she called me an outdated embarrassment, accepting her judgment that I didn't belong in their successful world. But the truth is, I had always belonged. I had built their world, sacrifice by sacrifice, choice by choice. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates holds the most power. The quiet mother-in-law who seems irrelevant might possess legal rights that could topple an empire. The elderly parent who appears helpless might have resources no one remembers. The family member others dismiss as a burden might be the keystone holding everything together. But here's the crucial part. You have to be brave enough to use that power when the moment comes. I could have signed those papers immediately, grateful for any scraps of attention from the family that had discarded me. Instead, I chose to demand the respect I had always deserved but never required. Family love without mutual respect is just emotional manipulation, and I had spent too many years accepting the latter while calling it the former. Your story might be different from mine, but I guarantee you have more strength than you realize. Maybe it's knowledge someone needs. Maybe it's a skill they've overlooked. Maybe it's simply the moral authority that comes from living with integrity when others chose shortcuts. Whatever it is, don't be afraid to use it when someone tries to erase you from your own life story. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt dismissed or undervalued by people who should have treasured you, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like mine out there. Stories of people who found their strength when everything seemed lost, who discovered their worth when others tried to diminish it, who chose dignity over convenience when the moment of truth arrived. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell us about a time when you stood up for yourself, when you refused to accept someone else's low opinion of your worth, when you discovered power you didn't know you possessed. Maybe it was standing up to a boss who took you for granted, or a spouse who stopped seeing your value, or children who forgot the sacrifices you made for their success. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that they're not alone in feeling invisible, and that being overlooked might just be their greatest advantage. The people who dismiss you today might need you tomorrow, and when that moment comes, you'll be ready. I'm Vivianne Patterson, the woman who turned a retirement homeroom into a boardroom, who transformed a bus ticket into a golden parachute, who proved that sometimes the last person standing is the one everyone thought would fall first. Remember my name because after 71 years of putting everyone else first, I finally learned to put myself first. And it's never too late to remember your own worth. Trust me on that. Subscribe, share your story, and never let anyone convince you that your chapter is over when you're the one still holding the pen.